Hi guys, welcome to today's lesson. So today we're going to go through the first and second questioning segment of a debate. If you haven't already, feel free to check out the previous videos where we talked about what big questions debate is, the affirmative constructive, which is your introduction speech, how to cut cards, how to flow a debate round, and how to formulate and present rebuttals. That being said, let's get right into it. So, the first questioning usually starts off with Aft saying, as first speaker, may I have the first question? Meaning, since they presented their speech first, can they have the first question? That has happened in every single debate round I have ever witnessed. It's pretty much a debate rule, like an unspoken debate rule, if that makes sense. Always let them if you're neg, and if you're Aft and the neg says no, I just doubt that's going to happen, so don't even worry about that. There are three main purposes to questioning. There is either poking holes in your opponent's case, asking for clarification, and asking for cards or pretty much proof that their evidence is true. It's important to differentiate who should be the one speaking if you're in a pair of two or if your opponents have a pair of two, so like they're a team. So if you're in a team, the first questioning segment, first person does the questioning segment. And first person is the person in the team that gives the constructive speech. So the way that works, if you're in a pair of two, just for clarification, the first person gives the constructive speech and does the first questioning. Then the second person does the rebuttal speech and does the second questioning that comes after the rebuttal speech. So if you're going up against a team and they seem to either not know this rule or not following this rule, you can pause them mid-questioning and tell them that. I typically let it go if the team seems to be struggling or they don't really know what they're doing or they seem new. I kind of just let it be. But if it's getting to the point where it seems that the opponents in the team are blatantly doing it and they're trying to get away with it because they think you won't say anything, then it would be proper to say something like, hey, actually, only first speaker is allowed to talk during this questioning. Second speaker, you'll have your chance during your questioning, according to the rules. And a lot of times, if the judge is a experienced judge, they should know this rule as well, and they'll back you up if they haven't already interrupted and said that themselves. So let's break this down. So poking holes is pretty much identifying or highlighting some sort of flaw in your opponent's idea or argument. One example is correlation or causation. A lot of people will say happiness correlates with creativity, and then you can ask, just wanted to clarify, you said that happiness and creativity correlate, not necessarily that one causes the other, correct? And then they'll say yes or no, right? That could be a good question. Other types of questions you could ask in order to poke holes are why questions. The only thing I would say is be careful with why questions, because why allows your opponent to obviously explain a lot, right? And you don't want to give them too much time in questioning, because then you're inherently giving them extra time to give out more information than they have already done in their actual speeches that are timed, right? So, again, be very careful with the why questions. For this year's resolution, creativity is a more powerful force than intelligence. A good why question would be if someone is talking about either or. If they're saying, oh, creativity, blah, 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 meaning it does this, blah, blah, blah. Or even if they just make a general presumption, like being able to adapt is an intelligent skill. Moving on, if they don't explain why, you can just say, do you ever explain why in your case that creates or that adaptation is an intelligent skill, or do you just say it as a fact? And then they might try to say, oh yeah, my card says it's because of blah blah blah. Usually if they do that, their card doesn't say that, and they're trying to use their card to back that up. So then you could say, can I see where specifically that says that? And that's another type of questioning we'll get into. So poking holes is probably one of the most effective strategies. It also kind of opens the door a little bit to your judge so they kind of see what you're going to get into in your rebuttal speech in terms of what doesn't make sense with your opponent's case. And you can also get a good feel for if your question and if what you're trying to segue into is good based on looking at the judge. So if you ask a question to poke a hole and the judge is like, oh yeah, that's a good question, then you know for sure you want to talk about that in your rebuttal speech. So asking for clarification. So try not to do this unless you really need to. I would only do this if you're super, super confused about your opponent's case. Or another reason you should ask for clarification is the second point where it says, can you restate contention 2 in your own words? Or in your own words, can you summarize the main idea of your contention 2? Something like that. The reason I say this is because, unfortunately, a lot of times in the debate circuit, you'll be going up against people who ran the exact same case as the person you had a couple rounds before. And usually this happens with schools. A lot of times someone will write a case and everyone uses it. And typically you could tell which one of them actually came up with the case themselves and which one of them just copied it from another person, because usually when they're reading the case it kind of sounds like they're trying to understand what they're saying too. So this can also help stump them a little bit. Then you can easily say in your rebuttal speech, Judge, my opponent's contention 2 makes no sense, and when I asked them to explain it in cross, they couldn't even do it themselves. Just so you know, cross-examination is the formal term for questioning. Alright, asking for cards. Asking for cards is the third tool you could utilize during questioning. I kind of talked a little bit about this with poking holes. So you only need to really ask for cards if the card seems false, which a lot of times cards will be blatantly false. Unfortunately, again, it's shocking how many people lie. I was just coaching at a tournament a couple weeks back, and my kiddo and his opponent were basically saying the exact opposite thing, and my kiddo had a card that backed his statement up, the opponent had a card that backed their statement, and my kiddo didn't call for the card. And just to clarify, the opponent's card said something about how creativity leads to depression. And if you pause and take a moment, that doesn't really make sense. And it really makes you question, is that what the card really said? Luckily for him, at the end of the round, his judge was an experienced college student judge, and he had asked to see both of their cards, and he discovered that the opponent's card was falsely misrepresenting the information. And truly, these were middle schoolers. It didn't seem like they had any malicious intent. It seemed like an honest mistake. But still, that being said, make sure you call for cards, especially when the card itself seems kind of fake, which I have done so many times in my career, and it's a really good thing to do. You could either ask for cards in questioning. A lot of times if you ask for a card during questioning, your opponent will say you can see it during prep, meaning after questioning, you can look at the card on your prep time. A lot of times you could also just ask the judge, hey judge, for calling cards, do you want us to use prep time or not? So some judges will say, yeah, if you're going to look at your opponent's card, start your prep time, because you get 3 minutes of prep time. So they'll tell you, use your prep time to look at the card. Some judges will say, no, you can look at cards, just don't be super slow. Like, try and be a little quick about it. So it depends. I would ask the judge. Obviously, it would be beneficial to not have to use your prep time, especially when you're trying to see if your opponent is the one lying, but you have to do it at your own expense. That's why a lot of people don't call for cards, but you'll be surprised. I have won so many rounds just based on calling cards. This one time in nationals, I was going up against this girl, and she was brutal. She was probably the strongest opponent I've ever in my career went up against, and I demolished 3 or 4 of her points by asking for some of her cards, because I was just listening to her case and I was like, there is no way, man, like this, and that. I asked to call for her cards, and she was taking a snippet out of the card in the intro where the guy, or where the author was saying, a lot of people believe this and this and that. Later on in the card, he goes to disprove that point. So I was saying, Judge, my opponent's completely misconstruing what this card is saying. This whole article is disproving that point. She can't just nitpick that part out of the article. It's like completely misconstruing it. And I did that for 3 or 4 of her cards. So definitely ask for cards. Oh, here's another example of my Colts. If you watched the previous videos, I mentioned how I went up against an opponent that talked about cults and that religious belief and practices are bad because they've led to cults. In her speech, she had said, I think 100,000 cults. And in my head, just in the United States alone, and in my head I was like, there is no way, 100,000 cults. I asked to see her card, it was actually 1,000 cults. So always be thinking, don't just mindlessly write stuff down, which we talked about in the flowing lesson. Really be processing what your opponent is saying, and like we talked about in flowing, you want to listen and then jot down the main point. You also want to jot down points that seem kind of out there or points that you know you could easily turn and the opponent's words against them, which is a really, really good skill to have. Alright, now moving on to questioning number 2. This is also 3 minutes. Again, AF usually, always actually, has the first question. Again, the purpose is to poke holes. Only ask for clarification at this point if a rebuttal that they made doesn't make sense. You should not be asking for clarification from their original case. At this point, if you haven't rebutted or if you don't understand their case still, that's kind of on you. And then again, ask for cards, but only if it's from new evidence that they brought up in their rebuttal, not from their original speech. That should already be done by now. So again, if you're in a pair, the second person is now the one speaking. Alright, activity time. So if you guys are in a class setting, I would like 2 people to both read one AF and one neg case that they have written. And then I want them to attempt to say whatever questions they can to their opponent. And then I want the whole class to participate. I want everyone to at least have one poke holes question, somewhere where you think you can poke holes to hint at where you're going to segue into in your rebuttal speech. So I want you guys to try that. If not, I am going to read a speech and I want you guys to pause the video, tell me some questions you think might be useful, and then I'll go into some questions that I think would be good to use. So let's pull up a case. Alright, so I'm going to read through this case. I have not shown you guys this case yet. I've mainly been focusing on the self-interest resolution cases. So this is the religion case. This was from my junior year of high school, and it wasn't that good. But I think that's the point because I want you guys to poke holes, right? So let's start. Let me get my timer. Is my opponent ready? Yes. Is my judge ready? Yes. Alright, my time will start on my first word. Resolve. We negate the resolution. On balance, societies do not benefit from religious beliefs and practices. Definitions. On balance, Cambridge. After considering the power or influence of both sides of a question. Society. A system of human organizations generating distinctive cultural patterns. Religious belief. The belief in the reality of the mythological, supernatural, or spiritual aspects of a religion. Practice. The actual application or use of an idea, belief, or method. Observations. Practices should be weighed more in the round because belief means nothing unless we act upon them to exhibit some sort of impact. 2. We should focus on the social cohesion because social cohesion is a very important driver of long-term prosperity and competitiveness. Cohesive societies are politically stable and should focus on economic growth and business development. Framework. Our impact should be maximizing life and social cohesion. Prefer this framework because life is a prerequisite to other frameworks, and without life, no one can exercise any other liberties or access any other impacts. Alright, I want you guys to pause there. Based on my definitions, observations, and framework, I want you guys to pause the video and think of questions that you can ask in order to poke holes. Alright, so one good question that I would say is, if we look at the resolution, we see religious beliefs and practices. So I would say, so you give the definition of practice, but isn't the resolution talking about religious practices and not just the general term of practices altogether? And the reason I say this is because look at my observation. My observation says we should focus on practices because beliefs mean nothing unless we act upon them. This is a very common argument for this resolution because a lot of people are going to talk about how individuals use religion in order to justify going to war and stuff like that. Wars is a very common point. Or, again, cults, for example. So that's not technically a religious practice, right? Religious practices, let's look up the definition. Religious practices. So, rituals, sermons, commemoration, veneration of deity. Yes, this is from Wikipedia, but overall it's pretty true. Religious practices are stuff like rituals, going to church, prayer. So the reason I want to ask that question is because if the opponent is talking about wars, I can say that's not a religious practice. Just because someone is going to war for their God, that doesn't mean that the religious belief and the religious practice itself is bad, right? If we're focusing on the resolution, we're talking about religious beliefs and religious practices. So I want to segue into that, and I'm kind of hinting at that in my questioning so the judge already is somewhat aware of that. So then your opponent is going to respond however they respond. But that would be a really strong questioning to start off with. If you guys have any other ideas for questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I can look them through and reply back to help you guys along. Contention 1. Religious texts spur violence. According to the medium, with some religions or with some religious people, there is a caveat that their religion is one of peace, love, charity, and harmony, only if everyone believes as they do. Harboring slightly different beliefs, cultures, or lifestyles then not only becomes unacceptable, but dangerous. Subpoint A. Religious texts discriminate. According to Mallow 15, religiously justified violence is first and foremost a problem of sacred texts and not a problem of misinterpretation of texts, per Jack Nelson Polymer. For example, Timothy 2:11, the Bible states, I permit no woman to teach or have authority over men. She is to keep silent. There are many instances in the Bible that discriminate against the disabled, non-virgin, sinners, women, etc. But how can we see this being practiced? According to the Encyclopedia World Problems and Human Potential, in many of the religions throughout the world, conservative Roman Catholic, evangelical, Pentecostal, Protestant, Mormon, Orthodox, Jewish, and Islam, women are denied equal opportunity in learning and teaching of religious knowledge that is available to men. Women cannot be ordained or given positions of leadership in most religions, and can never be ordained as a Roman Catholic priest. Jewish men begin each day with a ritualized prayer thanking God, quote, for not having made me a woman. In Orthodox Judaism, women can never be rabbis, nor can they mingle with men at prayer in a synagogue. Also, in many parts of the world, healthcare providers, insurance companies, and pharmacies are denying women their right to basic reproductive health care such as birth control, emergency contraception, and abortion on the grounds of religion. In fact, according to the ACLU, in some states, more than 40% of hospital beds are in a Catholic-run facility, leaving entire regions without any option for certain reproductive health care services. Alright, feel free to pause the video and give me some question ideas. Alright, let's circle back. So, some questions that I came up with is, against my Bible point, I can say, I mentioned a quote from the Bible about how women don't have the authority to teach over men. Do you know if this was from the Old Testament or the New Testament? And then the person would respond. Hint, the way I'm trying to segue into this is that, specifically in Christianity, the Old Testament is there just so people can read what life was like historically. However, it is known that people should not be following the Old Testament. For example, in the Old Testament, there were stories that said that if your husband died, you have to marry his brother. This was only for the purpose of being able to procreate, because at the time, obviously, there were very few people inhabiting the world. So this was simply just to procreate, which is why it was okay to marry your cousin and stuff like that. Now it's frowned upon to do that, even in the New Testament, which doesn't have any mention of that anymore. And usually churches tell you to follow the New Testament, and the Old Testament is there just so you could have knowledge about it. So that's where I'm trying to segue with that question. Another thing I could say is, you gave the example of Jewish men beginning each day with ritualized prayer, thanking God for not having made them a woman, right? I'm going to say yes. And then say, is there actually something in their religion that told them to start prayer like that? Or is that some sort of cultural tradition picked up that technically has nothing to do with actual religious beliefs or practices? Like, where is your link there? That's a good question I could ask too. Another question I could say is, you talk about how in many parts of the world, healthcare providers are denying women right to reproductive health care on the grounds of religion. Do you have an example of who, for example? Because I've never heard of healthcare providers denying stuff that's going to make them money. I don't understand this point. Do you have anything to back that up? Right? Alright. Moving on to my subpoint B. Subpoint B, religious text cause wars. According to Nielsen 12, religion divides people into separate groups and tells them that they are incompatible with each other. It provides justification for the killing of others and the promise of rewards for martyrs. Religion is also used to justify war and motivate soldiers. The Torah, Bible, and Quran all contain justifications for the killing of non-believers. They are clear that following a different religion is an unforgivable crime deserving death and destruction of entire cities. 2 Kings 10:19-27 records how every member of the religion of Baal was killed with God's approval. 2 Chronicles 28:6 records the killing of 120,000 valiant men because they did not worship God. SWN News states many examples of religion causing catastrophic wars as well. The 7 major crusades, which murdered an estimated 3 million people, with the reason being, my God is better than your God. The Inquisition, where the Roman Catholic Church converted Jews and Muslims to Catholicism. It is estimated Spain alone condemned 3 million, with about 300,000 being burned at the stake. Also, the Ottoman Empire conducted a policy of genocide on the Christian population, killing a total of 4 million Greek, Armenian, and Syrian Christians. Since 2001, the Afghanistan War has killed approximately 585,000 people, the Iraq War, 450,000 people, as a result of the ongoing war of Christians versus Muslims. As you can see, multiple wars in the past have been caused at the hands of religious beliefs, practices, and texts. However, these practices still occur in present day. And then that's where I'm going to segue into contention to modern prejudice. So, let's pause there. Do you guys have any ideas of questions that you could present in terms of my subpoint B? So first I'm going to focus at my section right here. So I would say you mentioned that a lot of these religious texts justify the killings of non-believers and then cite records in these religious texts on how certain members of other religions were killed. However, you never cite specific examples of these religious texts actually justifying them, just that they recorded that this happened. Is there actual proof that these religious texts justified these killings? That's a good question to poke a hole. Let's move a little bit further. So, then here are a lot of wars. I can ask another question about whether it's a religious practice or not. So you could say, is war a religious practice? Right? And they might try and say something, no, but it's a practice fueled by religion. Then you can say, may I have a follow-up question? Which is okay. I would say never really ask for more than one follow-up. It's not really nice to do. So for a follow-up against that, I can say, so are you saying just because someone is doing something for some twisted belief that they're doing it for their religion, that automatically puts the blame on religion? Shouldn't it put the blame on the person who is twisting it? And I can also just ask a hypothetical question and see how my opponent is going to answer. So I can ask questions such as, so let's say the government tells me that stealing is bad, and I decide to go and murder my neighbor because they stole from me. Does that mean it's the government's fault because they said stealing is bad? Or is that my fault for interpreting stealing as bad, meaning that I should go out and punish and kill the person who stole? Right? that can be applied with wars, because the Bible, for example, might say something like, if you are from a different religion, you're not going to be able to receive total happiness if you make it to heaven. That doesn't mean necessarily that, well, since my neighbor isn't Christian, I'm going to go murder him, right? Just because I decide to twist what the Bible is saying doesn't mean that it's the Bible's fault. So then that's how I'm going to apply what they said in my rebuttal speech. Do these start to make sense? I hope so. So let's move on to my contention 2, modern prejudice. Contention 2, modern prejudice, subpoint A, discrimination and harassment. According to Gale 17, since 1997, religious discrimination incidents have doubled in employer-related incidents in the United States. As described by Pew Research Center 14, in nearly 3 out of every 4 countries of the world, religious groups experience harassment by individuals or groups in society. The harassment and intimidation take many forms, including physical or verbal assaults, desecration of holy sites, and discrimination against religious groups in employment, education, and housing. The article specifically states that in the Middle East, North Africa, harassment of Muslims occurs in 75% of countries. In Americas, Jews face harassment or intimidation in 29% of countries. For example, a neo-Nazi group in Chile. In Europe, Jews were harassed in 69% of countries in the region. Muslims experience harassment in 71%. One example of this discrimination against the Islam faith. According to the FBI, hate crimes against Muslims rose 1,617% from 2000 to 2001 alone. These acts of discrimination extend to daily life as well, because according to Hatem Bazian, a lecturer at the UC Berkeley and leader of the college's Islamophobia Research and Documentary Project, of the people surveyed, almost 80% said they feel at least somewhat worried about the safety of their family in the U.S. According to the World Economic Forum 19, religious violence is undergoing a revival. The past decade has witnessed a sharp increase in violent sectarian and religious tensions. These include Islamic extremist warning, global jihad, and power struggles between Sunni and Shia Muslims in the Middle East. And then that is the end of that. So I will pause the time. What are questions that you guys think would be good for poking holes in this subpoint? So we can start off with saying, how does someone discriminating a religious person based on their religious beliefs show that religious beliefs and religious practices are not beneficial to society? They might give an answer, and then you can probably do a follow-up depending on that answer, saying, if it's so harmful though, wouldn't that religious person denounce their religion if it was being so harmful, the discrimination they were receiving because of it? Right? So that shows that that individual person, the pros outweighed the cons. So their religious belief and practices were more beneficial to them than not. For all of these examples, I could ask, so all of these examples of discrimination and harassment, at what point are specific religious practices and religious beliefs enabling this harassment? What I would mainly do with questions in this section is just kind of talk about what specific religious beliefs and practices is enabling this discrimination and harassment, and then that other question about showing the impact of these people. And that kind of applies to all the points. Alright, lastly, let's go into subpoint B. Subpoint B, modern religious violence. According to the World Economic Forum 19, religious violence is undergoing a revival. The past decade has witnessed a sharp increase in violent sectarian and religious tensions. These include Islamic extremists waging global jihad and power struggles between Sunni and Shia Muslims in the Middle East. According to Pew, in 2018, more than a quarter of the world's countries experienced high incidents of hostilities motivated by religious hatred, mob violence related to religion, terrorism, and harassment of women for violating religious codes. The spike in religious violence is global and affects virtually every religious group. A 2018 minority rights group report indicates that mass killings and other atrocities are increasing in countries both affected and not affected by war alike, with bloody encounters recorded in over 50 countries. Hostilities against Muslims and Jews also increased across Europe, as did threats against Hindus in more than 18 countries. Making matters worse, 55 of the world's 198 countries imposed heightened restrictions on religions, especially Egypt, Russia, India, Indonesia, and Turkey. In fact, even in recent days, it can be observed that the multitude of religious conflicts, wars, and harassment leads to loss of millions of lives. Therefore, when looking at the impacts of the round, we must prefer the fact that the negation proves that the loss of life and decrease of quality of life, which is the ultimate disadvantage to society. Alright, so what kind of questions would you guys utilize against my subpoint B? So, starting off with my very first sentence, I would say, you mentioned that religious violence is undergoing a revival. Is this just violence that has some sort of religious component to it? Or is this violence that is actually fueled by religious beliefs and religious practices? So that would be a really good question to ask. And then I could kind of apply that to this whole case, that nowhere do I really mention the direct link on the specific religious beliefs and specific religious practices kind of leading to these impacts. I kind of just say because of religion, right? I don't actually, I guess, strongly highlight that direct link between the two. And I say, how do countries restricting religion have anything to do with the negative implications of religious beliefs and religious practices? These countries are not doing that for religious reasons, are they? Right, so I would just ask something like that. Again, a lot of these questions can be applied to multiple of these points. So that is just a few ideas that I had in terms of questions reading through this for the first time in a while. Oh wow. I had multiple, as you guys can see, contentions. I really like this contention about prostitution and drugs. A lot of times I will run a kind of joke case at some tournaments, especially leading up to state and nationals, to kind of throw my opponents off their toes, especially because a lot of people would completely prep out against my cases and would have it pretty much written out word for word and be able to have all these rebuttals against me. So I would use stuff like this. It was very funny. Anyways, I hope this was helpful. Again, if you guys have any other ideas, feel free to leave them below in the comments and I could give you guys some feedback for those. That being said though, that concludes it for today's lesson. So I hope you guys learned something. Don't forget, for homework, I want you guys to start working on your rebuttals and at least making a list of all the possible rebuttals you can make based on general stock arguments for this year's topic. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. Bye!